Well, I had another drink. The caretaker stayed with me. And after a while, I managed to coax out of him the full story of what was meant to be going on in that room. And this is what he told me. He said that the ghost that turned up in the room was a former slave. The hotel was the slave master's house, and all the land around was a plantation. The ghost that turned up was a former slave called Frederick. And Frederick had been a very, very big, strong man. Yeah, even stronger than you. You look really strong there, didn't you? Yeah, and you're looking strong too. Big, strong man. And he had been working as a blacksmith, and he had been caught in the interior of West Africa and brought to the coast. He'd been brought to coast by slave traders, and there he had been sold. Been sold to a British captain of a ship, and he'd been branded. I mean, they'd got a hot iron and burnt his skin to say that he was owned by somebody. That's what they used to do in those times. And then he was taken onto the ship. He was so strong that when they tried to take him on the ship, he fought them and fought them and fought them until they had to put him into chains, and they used dogs, fierce big dogs, to make sure that he was subdued, to make sure that they could get him on the ship. And he was taken into the hold of the ship, and there he was kept in the hold with many, many other captured Africans. And that ship sailed all the way across from the west coast of Africa to Jamaica. When the coast of Jamaica came into sight, the captain of that ship got all the slaves up on deck, and when the ship pulled into port, they took the slaves off and they sold them at an auction. That's what they used to do to slaves, to captured Africans. They took them in the ship, took them all the way to the Caribbean, and they sold them to people who were working on big fields, plantations, where they grew crops like sugarcane. He sold him, and still chained and still bound, Frederick was taken on a cart all the way to the plantation of Jefferson, the Jefferson plantation in Black River of Jamaica. There, being such a strong and big person, he was put to work cutting the sugarcane. You want to cut sugarcane with me? Go like that. Can you do that? You could do it straight away really well. Okay. Now sugarcane is tall as these vases, okay, even taller. And it's very, very hard. It's back-breaking work. And they work very, very hard all day. And if they didn't work hard enough, there were people came with whips and whipped them to make sure they kept working, which wasn't very nice, was it? Okay. But they worked for a long time. Now Frederick, he soon learnt the Creole, the language that the other captured African slaves had learned. He learned that Creole, and he began to talk to them. One hot afternoon, when they'd been working all morning, the number one chain gang, the biggest chain gang that did the hardest work, took a rest, and Frederick said to them, as they were sat down, "The birds fly free. Why can we not be free like those birds? Who has the right to make us work all day for no money, for no pay? Nobody has the right to take us from our country and separate us from our family. Why should people whip us? Why should they be able to sell us to somebody else the next morning? Why should they be even able to kill us and suffer no consequences whatsoever? They treat us like animals, the people here. And I, Frederick, would rather live freely as a human being than be treated like an animal. I am not a dog, and I would rather die as a human being than live as a dog." And all the number one chain gang, all the Africans who were in that gang, they said, "Yes, it's right." And Frederick said, "You know what? We outnumber the people who run this plantation. We outnumber them vastly by maybe 10 to 1. And they have guns. Yes, they have pistols. They have whips. But I think we could actually take them on. What do you think? And the slaves began to talk among themselves. Just as they were talking, Thomas, the head overseer of the plantation, the boss's second-hand man, the man who owned the plantation, his boss, his second-hand, his staff, rode up on a big horse and said, "What are you doing there? Get back to work." He rode up with a whip, and he had the whip poised above him, waiting. And the slaves slowly struggled up because they'd been working all day, they were tired. But there was one slave, a young boy, he wasn't more than 12, he was called Kwame, and he'd just arrived, and he wasn't used to the work that they'd been doing. And his hands were sore, his feet were blistered, and he didn't get up very quickly. And Thomas, the head overseer, he lashed at Kwame. Yeah. And he caught him on his arm, and Kwame whimpered. It hurt him. And he lashed at him again, and he caught his thigh. And at that point, something in Frederick, the big African that I told you about earlier, something in Frederick snapped. Something broke in him. And he stood up, and he said, "Leave the boy." And Thomas, the overseer, said, "What did you say, nigger?" And Frederick walked towards Thomas, the overseer, on his horse, with his hands outstretched. And it looked as if not a brick wall, not a hurricane could have stopped Frederick. Thomas, the overseer, took his whip and lashed at Frederick, lashed his face, lashed his chest. But it seemed not to register in Frederick's mind. And Frederick reached out and pulled Thomas the overseer off his horse and pulled him down. And at this point, because there's so many young kids, I'm going to hold the story. And by the time Frederick had finished with the overseer, he was dead. The man who had whipped Frederick was dead. Now all the other overseers had heard the commotion, had heard the struggle, and they rushed to help Thomas the overseer. But none of them had been able to pull Frederick off Thomas the overseer until Frederick had killed him. Well, the slave master, the head of the whole plantation, he heard what had happened, and he ordered Frederick to be brought to the courtyard. And he had all the slaves gathered in the courtyard. And then, as an example, he decided that Frederick would be whipped unto death. They were going to whip Frederick until he died as a punishment. And Frederick was tied to the post, and then the slave master went to his head slave driver and handed him the whip and said, "You whip Frederick." But the head slave driver refused because he was frightened, and he knew that all the other slaves secretly supported what Frederick had done. So the slave master turned to the new overseer, the new head overseer, and said, "You whip Frederick." But even that overseer was scared because there was a whiff of rebellion around the plantations. Some trouble was brewing, and they knew that whoever whipped Frederick might have a very hard time later on. Everyone the slave master asked refused to whip Frederick. So the slave master got down off his horse and said he would do it himself. And he got the whip going, and the whip went like this. He lashed at Frederick. He lashed at his back. He lashed him. Lashed him again. He kept on lashing him until he was almost dead. But just before Frederick died, he called out to the slave master. He said, "Master, me a come for ya." That means, "Master, I'm going to get you."